Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously, without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized.
Systems either change or die.
Into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
And wake up. There is one way. Fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Eleanor.
Two men encounter one another on a street on Imperial Coruscant. The first one says, "Boy, it sure is nice to see you out of prison. How was Narkina 5?" The second man replies, "It was amazing. In the mornings, we got breakfast in bed. We were given our choice between hot chocolate and freshly ground calf. We played grab-a-ball on a manicured pitch. There was a 3-course lunch with soup and dessert. Then we'd play board games. We'd take a nap, and after dinner, they'd show us holodramas till we fell asleep." The first guy can't believe it. Wow, people must spread a lot of lies about that place. The other day I was talking with Antilles, who got out last year. He told me horror stories. The second man nods seriously and said, "That's why he got sent back."
Oh, no. I thought you were going to make a joke about it being, like, shocking or something.
No. Hello and welcome to Daughters of Ferrix, the first ever place for Star Wars analysis that looks at the series through real-world politics and history, aside from all the other ones. I'm your host, Eleanor Mueller, and with me is my co-host, Sophia Dunstan.
Hi.
Before we get started, I want to thank Josh Hyam for their support. Josh, you're the twin ion engines that help this starfighter of a show fly. Was that simple enough for you, Sophie? Are you happy?
Yes.
If you're interested in early access to the show, episode outtakes, the Daughters of Ferrix Discord server, monthly bonus episodes, and helping us afford to survive, check us out at patreon.com/Daughters of Ferrix. A+ for survival.
Do it.
Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome to the show our guest for today. He's got a PhD from the University of Sussex. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter and president of the International Society for First World War Studies. He's a co-author of Battles That Changed the Galaxy and the author of The History and Politics of Star Wars, The First World War in Computer Games, and the much-anticipated book, Star Wars, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, due out later this year. Historian Chris Kempshall, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come along. I've been looking forward to this for ages.
Oh yeah, I mean, you and I have had more than a few conversations. Multiple times you've given me like research and writing tips, but this is the first time that besides like a couple of small mentions in like scripts that I wrote, this is the first time I'm allowing us as a show to really get into the history and politics of Star Wars. Because like, it's a pretty big inspiration for the show, right? But I knew really early on that I wanted to work super hard to not just copy your work.
Be my guest or do it better.
Sure. Anyway, I'm really pleased to get this chance to actually get into it.
I mean, particularly given as I think you're responsible for selling quite a few of my books. You've inflicted my work on like a number of semi-willing people. So it seems like the least I could do.
You know, you could say inflicted. I would say bestowed.
Blessed, maybe?
Yeah. I do say, and it's not a joke, it is required reading. If you're listening to the show and you're not actively giving Chris money, what are you doing? You know?
Yeah, buy 5 or 6 copies. There's plenty to go around.
At least. So we're going to chat about the book, and then at the end, maybe sneak in a bit of discussion about your hot new title, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, at the very end. So,
oh, go on then.
Stick around, I guess, if you're listening. There is a reason for you to keep listening. So, for our listeners at home, The History and Politics of Star Wars is a nonfiction tour of the historical and political implications of the series. It's organized into chapters about the Empire, the Republic, rebellion, the relationship of the Jedi to the state they serve, and the ever-changing role of identity politics. One thing I find especially admirable about the work is that you take this extremely holistic view of Star Wars. You talk about things both in and out of universe. There are subsections in each chapter that tend to feature discussion of the development and implications of the original trilogy, of course, but then moving on to the first wave of the expanded universe in the 90s, and the prequels in the early aughts, and new canon and the sequels. So there is obviously a tremendous amount of media in Star Wars, and kind of because of that, we seldom see critical analysis taking stuff like the expanded universe as seriously as the original trilogy. What was the value to you of engaging with the series on a larger scale like that?
It's a really interesting question So with the study of Star Wars, traditionally it's focused on the films for any number of really, really good reasons. This isn't a criticism. Firstly, if you want to look at what George Lucas thinks, you're going to look at George Lucas's films, that's fine. And watching a film doesn't take very long. You had the original trilogy and then you had the prequel trilogy, and I've definitely watched them all in one day before. I know it's a day, but...
Oh yeah, you can knock it out.
You can absolutely do so. It's a self-contained thing, and it makes absolute perfect sense to focus on the films. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, and I'm not telling your listeners anything they don't already know. There are quite a lot of Star Wars studies that focus on the films. The problem with that is that it's not all of Star Wars. As you say, Star Wars is vast. There's a lot of media. At times when writing the book, I may have, as I slowly eroded under the weight of what it was I was doing, considered that maybe there's too much Star Wars. But it's not a reasonable thing to ask of a historian coming to the thing cold, I need you to watch 6 films and then read 1 million books.
Approximately
1 million books. And then I need you to also then play a ton of computer games and read a bunch of comics and stuff. You can't do it. It's too much. Particularly when you're coming to it at this point when the entirety of the expanded universe is behind us. And Disney is making new stuff. Disney Lucasfilm's making new stuff. I was able to approach it from a position of either as a benefit or as a sign of a misspent youth, of having wasted my life reading this stuff anyway. So I didn't need to go and introduce myself to Timothy Zahn's books or Kevin J. Anderson's books or play a bunch of computing, because not only had I already read them, I already owned them. This was the only way it was going to happen. That my thought process when I was planning for the book, that Star Wars Studies needs this. It needs a really good interaction with the expanded universe. Now, there are a few bits and pieces. There's a series of essays in a compiled edition called A More Civilized Age by Rich Handley and Joseph Berinato, which look at the expanded universe. And there's been some other kind of bits and pieces of analysis of Jaina Solo and Mara Jade and the like as feminist symbols and the like, which are super cool, really interesting. But it needed someone to come and go, okay, I'm going to do a bunch of analysis for you, but I'm also going to explain the overarching plots of the expanded universe, because whoever was going to come next needed something to stand on. They didn't necessarily need to read the entirety of everything. They might just be able to get away with a quick overview and then focus in on just the X-Wing books and comics or whatever it was that they wanted. So that kind of providing for the next generation was important to me. To an extent, that's kind of what academics are supposed to be doing anyway. We're not necessarily supposed to be ring fencing and barbed wiring up our fields of study. We're supposed to share and play nicely with each other. But also, I'd become increasingly convinced that, again, this isn't a surprise to anybody, there are subsets of the Star Wars fandom that the lines between the films and the expanded universe have completely blurred. They talk about characters like Luke Skywalker, go, I really wanted him in the sequels to be a complete badass and do all of these things. That Luke Skywalker never existed. The person you're talking about never appears in any of the films. He does appear in the expanded universe novels, and the blending of those two things has created a situation where people are remembering film characters through the book and the comics and the computer game actions. And I find that super interesting as a historian and as kind of an academic and the like, that we've got to the point when the differentiation between the characters has eroded, it's completely broken down. Once you've reached the point when the Luke Skywalker that you're talking about may well be from the Jedi Knight computer games or the Darksaber novel or whatever, and you're assuming that is the same Luke Skywalker as appeared in the films, means that you kind of got to take it all as a whole. Otherwise, you lose so much of the material and so many of the reference points. And then on top of that is the fact that the films stopped being made in 1983. But history doesn't stop. Events don't stop, and neither does Star Wars. So if you want to talk about Star Wars in the 90s, you need to talk about Star Wars in the 90s. It's no good going back to Return of the Jedi because it's from a different time. It's pre-end of the Cold War. If you want the relevance, you've got to go looking for it.
That ongoing nature of Star Wars does mean that often in its publishing, there are going to be things that are much more contemporary than the films. A film takes 3+ years of pre-production, production, post-production, all of that before it comes out. We see the first implications of 9/11 in Star Wars in 2005, essentially.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Films take ages to make. We can see that in the world anyway. We can also say that in the number of Star Wars films that have been announced and never actually kind of come into being. That
5, 6, 7.
Yeah. Any number of things can happen with a film. And I say this as somebody who has, except for my most recent book, blown all of my deadlines. Writing a book is much quicker than making a film, at least if you stick to schedule, which is hard. So books are able to react to events quicker than films, and you definitely see that in the expanded universe.
At the beginning of History and Politics, you devote several pages to this broad timeline of key Star Wars releases and concurrent geopolitical events. You once told me that when something comes out can be at least as relevant as like its overt messaging. Can you expand on that idea a little bit?
So the concept that the context is the text, you know, the time period that you are writing it in is to an extent the focus and the topic of the book. That's not just a Star Wars thing. That, as you said, you know, I've mentioned this to you before. It's a universal thing. So since 2015, I've written a book about First World War computer games. I've written a book about First World War Allied relations, and I've written a book about history and politics of Star Wars. We'll ignore the Lucasfilm, the DK stuff. If we think about what's happened in the world since 2015, I don't think it's strange that a historian and other historians, all of my colleagues, have focused in on computer games as a method of understanding the world and fandom and interaction with big ideas about society and fascism, racism, all of these things. I don't think it's a shock that me and my colleagues around 2015 started zooming in on this stuff. So is my book about First World War computer games actually about First World War computer games? Or is it about how people use computer games to understand the world around them? I wrote my book on First World War Allied relations at the same time I was writing it in the immediate aftermath of Britain leaving the European Union, a moment when Britain kind of disconnects itself from its major European partners. And I'm writing a book about the importance of international cooperation during major periods of international upheaval. Again, there might be something underlying in my mindset that suggests that this is an important thing to write about. And again, if we look at, you know, Star Wars as a cultural phenomenon and as a culture war phenomenon, again, is it that weird or that ridiculous that a historian would suddenly focus in on Star Wars as a way of understanding, again, the internet and the world and history and politics? Are my books actually about what they say they're about? Or are they actually about what was going on in the world when I was writing them? And I say to students all the time, you know, bring me a history book, tell me what the title is, and then tell me what the date it was published was, and I'll tell you what that book is about. I don't need to look at the contents. I don't need to look at the actual details of the book. Fine, it's a book about the French Revolution. Sure, there's going to be stuff about the French Revolution in there. But if it was written in 1991, I reckon it's probably about the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, because that's the world that it's being written in. Historians, we all exist in the same world as you do. There's a tendency to think that we're somehow immune from the stuff that goes on around us, and we're really not. I mean, firstly, because I can think of some history books I really hate that are written about things going on in the world and the like. But if you understand that historians are just human beings and we're writing about stuff that's going on around us, and sometimes we use the past as a way of processing that, then you get loads more out of reading history books. It's a useful way of understanding. It's not sometimes it's used as an insult that people are kind of presenteeism, or they're rewriting history as if that's a bad thing. History books are an argument, and there's a reason why we argue the things we argue at the time that we argue them.
I think that's very interesting that you say that, because what you were discussing kind of the last segment before this one was almost what I would describe as Star Wars as a mythology, as something that people are adapting to their own cultural preferences, to their own political views, to their own aesthetic taste. And I think that that's kind of a very powerful comparison to be made, because Star Wars is not just Star Wars. As you say, it is also all of the things that are influencing it and surrounding it when it's being made, and also when it's being consumed.
I mean, I imagine we're going to talk at various points about like George Lucas and the like, and we'll talk about what he thinks he's doing with Star Wars and what he wants to do and what he wants the audience to get from. We have to. At the same time, this is going to sound really stupid, but it's not the first time I've said something stupid out loud, and it probably won't be the last time just in this podcast, so we'll just sail straight past it. But there is a significant part of me that doesn't care what George Lucas thinks.
Oh, yeah.
Star Wars means what I think it means, and what you think it means. It doesn't matter what George Lucas's intention was. On some level, Star Wars exists in the receivership. It exists in the audience reception. So who cares what the director thinks?
Death of the author.
Well, definitely Star Wars is this thing that is very alive within its own fandom. I mean, the people making Star Wars now are almost across the board people who are fans of Star Wars. Like, you have people in like chat rooms or whatever for the last at least 7 years really specifically saying they need to let the fans make Star Wars. And it's like, have you talked to people who are writing Star Wars stories and working on these projects? Like, they are just like you. Sometimes they are worse. Like anyone following Pablo Hidalgo knows that man has been in the sauce for 3 decades or however long. I am sure that when George Lucas is dead and gone, we will still be talking about him. But my God, is there so much more to Star Wars than just him?
Yeah, absolutely. If someone takes a reading of Star Wars that is completely contrary, people clearly have, come out of it going, oh wow, the Rebel Alliance of the United States. I don't think they are, and I don't think George Lucas thinks they are, but the fact that you think they are interests me, and that alone is worthy of study and analysis and understanding that, okay, I hate to say it, you're wrong, but I'm interested in the reasons why you're wrong.
On the subject of George Lucas, I want to pick your brain on what you think of George Lucas's understanding of the politics of his own work. Because, something you write about is the way that Lucas took lots of open inspiration from an understanding of specifically pop history. An example that I think about, frankly, weekly, is this very firmly held idea that Nixon was especially poised to become an American dictator, which is not accurate. Nixon, for all of his faults, that's not one of them.
Yep.
How do you think just listening to what George Lucas says and what George Lucas thinks he meant can limit us when we're looking at history in Star Wars this way?
One of my rules of thumb when it comes to George Lucas is that George Lucas says a lot of stuff. And George Lucas might not necessarily be the best source on the thought process and decision-making of George Lucas. At times, it appears that George Lucas hasn't met George Lucas. And, if you go away and kind of look at all of the ideas he said that the sequel trilogy were about to be, it's like 12 different films. I'm not a filmmaker, but I can count to 3. This is more. But at the same time, as I say in the book, George Lucas is not under any compunction to be a historian. And I think that sometimes is a criticism that is unfair labelled at him. Oh, he's got the history wrong. So what? He's not a historian. He's not making a historical documentary. He's definitely inspired by history and he's drawing on history. Some of that history is wrong. Again, about Richard Nixon, where it's become a story that he's told so often that it's a very easy anecdote for him now, but it just isn't true. That, Nixon was going to change the Constitution and seek endless terms. It just factually is not correct. But it doesn't matter because it helps us understand why George Lucas makes the decisions that he does. So with George Lucas, there's a touch of the J.R.R. Tolkien about him. J.R.R. Tolkien used to get super angry, really angry, when people were like, I've read The Lord of the Rings. You were in the trenches during the First World War, J.R.R. Did that have a lasting impact, maybe, on your mindset and the way that you view the world, and also the stuff you've put in your massive books? And then you get really angry. No. It's not about the First World War. It's not about the trenches. It's just a book about dwarves and elves and hobbits. I don't know why you're trying to read more into it. And I have no problem believing that J.R.R. Tolkien believes that, but I don't believe that. And you can apply the same to George Lucas, that his understandings of history are cultural. They come from films. They come from media. They come from being absorbed from living in America and growing up in America in that time period. Therefore, it doesn't matter that Richard Nixon wasn't about to change the Constitution. He's enough of a scumbag that George Lucas's view of him makes perfect sense in George Lucas's mind. And therefore, sure, why wouldn't Palpatine be based on Richard Nixon as opposed to a million other scumbags? Because that's the guy for George Lucas. And it doesn't matter that he's, dragging it in from half-remembered conversations in bars, presumably. You don't have to believe the world is flat to understand the decisions of people who believed the world was flat. In that sense, it's enough that they believe it. It's enough that George Lucas believes it. Once you accept that George Lucas believes it, you can see it in the films.
I think bringing up sort of Tolkien's relationship with his own work is really insightful in that this is something that he struggled with for decades. And
yeah, he did.
Leading him to the point where he wrote that very famous prologue to Fellowship. He talks about allegory, that is to say, the specific, inspiration, replication of something else in your work, and applicability. And applicability is I can look at this and I can compare it to this thing, and there are things that match. And Tolkien says, you might say that the One Ring is the nuclear bomb, and I think that's ridiculous, but I guess it is applicable in that way. This, to me, brings to mind a term you use in the First World War in computer games, which is authenticity light. That's within certain visual and narrative depictions of history. The goal of an artist isn't necessarily fidelity, but resemblance to an audience's idea of that historical moment. You use the term in reference to war games, but do you think it can be applied to Star Wars, which is, more historically abstract?
Firstly, you just go back to the Tolkien bit, he's gone to all of these lengths, he's written this enormous, great big prologue, and still some stupid, annoying First World War historian, 100 years later, is still going on about the fact that it's probably about the First World War, he'd hate me. Probably not just for that reason. Authenticity light. Yeah, I do think it's a useful concept because people don't necessarily know a great deal about the past, capital T, capital P, about history. They have a sense of what it was like or what they would expect it to be like. And I remember in the lead up to Rogue One, which I really, really like the film Rogue One. I think they struck a really good tone with it. It's great fun. It ticked all of my boxes. But I remember people talking about, oh, fantastic, we're going to get like a really grim, gritty Vietnam War film and it's going to be great. And I remember thinking, is it going to be great? Is that what Star Wars needs? Like a really kind of bleak, horrifying view of the Vietnam War. But bearing in mind that Star Wars is supposed to kind of be for children. How badly do we want to traumatize the kids? But when you deconstruct that a little bit, is that what people were talking about wasn't the Vietnam War. They were basically thinking Apocalypse Now. They were thinking the cinematic version of the Vietnam War because, how many people who are, out and about at the moment actually served in Vietnam? A lot of people in America, literally none in England, which slightly changes the audience. But it's that feeling of the event as processed through the media. I've watched Apocalypse Now, I've watched Full Metal Jacket, I've watched Platoon, I've watched all of these films, and therefore I know what the Vietnam War felt like and was like, and therefore I want that in Star Wars, which is a really interesting way of understanding how people understand the past because they're not processing the event because they weren't there. They didn't participate in it. They weren't on the ground in that way, but they have this concept of what the event was like. For people in England, there's a subset of the population over here, 50 to 60-year-old white men who I swear to God think they fought in the Second World War. They lived through the Blitz, they flew Spitfires, they did all of these things, and they talk about the Second World War as if they were there. But what they actually happened is their parents were there and they've watched a lot of Second World War films. And therefore they know what the Second World War was like in a way that I think is kind of offensive. But that's what authenticity light is. It's the feeling of what the past was like. And you definitely get an element of that in Star Wars. Again, George Lucas was alive during the Vietnam War. It was a big thing for him, but he wasn't in Vietnam. And he wasn't in the French Revolution. He wasn't in the Weimar Republic. He wasn't in Imperial Rome. He's got a sense of what these things were like based on the media that he's consumed, and that's what informs, that's the thing that radiates. So it doesn't matter what the actual event was, what matters is the perception, the feeling of it.
It's rather perverse, media making media.
Goodness gracious me.
On that thread, do you see Star Wars as actually referencing quote unquote real world history, or more so like calling back to war films like The Dam Busters or Paths of Glory?
It's a bit of both. There's loads of calling back to media. The Dam Busters, Paths of Glory are perfect examples of, and even when you listen to the guys who did Solo, they didn't talk about, we're going to do this thing on a planet and it's going to be trenches like the First World War. They talked about it being trenches like Paths of Glory.
Right.
Which is great because I love Paths of Glory. It's one of my favourite films, but at the same time, it's not the thing. And you get, callbacks to the burning of the Reichstag or Caesar taking control of the Roman Republic. And these are events that happened, but the understanding and the portrayal of them is cinema based, I think, largely. I'm probably doing George Lucas a slight disservice with what I'm going to say. I don't have a problem believing that he's read books on the Third Reich or Julius Caesar. Whether they're academic history books or pop history books, I think is the key, in that, firstly, academic history books tend to be, as a writer of academic history books, quite dull and difficult to read. Whereas pop history books are read by human beings and they contain words that you can say out loud. So even that disjuncture is a form of smoothing out the edges of the past, to narrativize it, to make it something kind of slightly easier to consume and understand, which again, is probably something that academic historians should learn from pop history books. But history is culture, effectively. And I think that's where the roots of it come from, whether or not it's a history book you buy in an airport, or Paths of Glory, or a documentary that you can listen to in parts on the radio, or whatever it is. It's that version of the past rather than the thing. The thing is irrelevant in that sense, that it's about how it's processed.
Something that I've talked about before is the ways in which a lot of the Empire is portrayed is inspired by by not, Nazi Germany as an institution, but triumph of the wills.
Yeah.
What I actually tend to talk about is like, we should be aware of the fact that the empire isn't just inspired by the Nazis, they are inspired by and sometimes replicating visual ideas that we understand from Nazi propaganda, understanding Nazis as this overwhelming, powerful force.
Unstoppable war machine, the Blitzkrieg of 1939.
Infinite resources.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huge budget for the film. Genuinely, Triumph of the Wills, so expensive to make.
Isn't it the most expensive film until like the 60s?
I think so. I don't know the actual numbers, but yeah. But I think another part of that we have to recognize is that one of the reasons why footage from Triumph of the Wills is so resonant with people, I guess, not like in the, oh, rah, rah, we like Nazis way, but like in, I understand that way, is that it is narrativizing that, God, I can't remember what the event was that they were actually filming. And let's be clear, Triumph of the Wills is actually really slow and really boring if you've watched it.
God, yeah, it doesn't fly by.
Yeah, no. You feel it. You go, they sure did make this. But I don't know. I think it's really comprehensible to people in a way that actual events aren't.
Yeah, it's so much easier to turn this into some form of story, some form of kind of narrative arc. And George Lucas isn't just a filmmaker, he's a student of film. So of course he went and watched Triumph of the Wills. He's of that generation where it probably got shown in school.
Oh yeah.
Firstly shown in history classes and then shown in film classes as a way of understanding it. And that element of going, well, actually, I can just borrow from this because turns out the Nazis are real good at this. Constructing a visual narrative to make people do exactly what they want. Whilst it's not a film that I will ever willingly watch again, they got a lot of bang for their buck. Riefenstahl was pretty good at her job. So being able to borrow from that and also go, well, actually, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. If I want to convince people that these guys are fascists, I'll just let the fascists do it for me. Why would I spend the time and effort when I could just do exactly what they did and hope that people get the message? It's like that painfully stupid debate on Twitter recently about Starship Troopers. Of course it's satire, but they're just doing what the Nazis did. But they're winking at the camera whilst they do it.
Your first couple of publications, we talked about this earlier, were both about the First World War. That's very much your area as a researcher. But for the last few years, you keep also doing this stuff around and for Star Wars. What's the connection there? How did that transition kind of happen?
The series of events that lead me to be sat here with you now are so wildly improbable as to be nonsense. As you mentioned at the beginning, I did my PhD in the First World War, in kind of First World War Allied relations. I'm something of a fake historian in that most of my study before that was in media studies because I wanted to be a sports journalist. I wanted to be a soccer commentator. And then I realised that actually you don't need that many soccer commentators. Those positions are largely filled. There's no possibility for employment here. And having gained that realisation, I took the logical step and went, well, academia is clearly the better bet for something with long-term employment prospects. So I did First World War stuff and I finished my PhD and then was tired, very, very tired. And I didn't want to look at my PhD thesis for a number of years. But I'm just a stupid geek and I like computer games and I like geeky stuff. I saw the chance to give a conference paper at a university that I wanted to work at. They were doing a conference about the First World War and the moving image and I was like, computer games move. So I'll do a little thing about First World War computer games. And I did that. And a publisher that I'd been previously in contact with said, oh, we saw you gave this paper. Do you want to write a short book about First World War computer games? Yeah, I do. So sure, why not? I'll do that. And then the conference people were like, we'd also like to do like an academic journal of papers. Do you want to do one in that as well? So it was like, well, okay, this thing has got 2 publications out of it. So I did the book, I did the conference, and I did the academic article that came out. And the article came out 2015, which is right in the kind of the opening stages of the first couple of years of the First World War centenary. And it got picked up by this YouTube channel called The Great War, who were basically going through the First World War, basically in real time, week by week. And they shared it on their Twitter and their Facebook. And normally what happens when you release an academic article is I could name and car share with the people who will read it. I'll read my friends' papers, my friends will read my papers. Instead, this time it got read by like 3,000 people, which set off like sirens in the offices of the company who published it. And their history commissioning editor emailed me and said, let's have a chat about other stuff you'd like to do. So I met up with him and he was like, so what ideas for books have you got? I was like, are we talking like grown-up stuff or geeky stuff? And he was like, whatever you want. I was like, well, I want to write a book about Star Wars. And I pitched Battles That Changed the Galaxy to him as a military history of Star Wars. And then I realised quite early on that it wasn't going to work. So I changed it to History and Politics of Star Wars. And then Disney kept changing all of their release schedules for the films, which is my excuse for why I missed the deadlines for the book by just light years. And eventually, lockdown and the pandemic came, and I needed to go to the British Library because there was stuff that I needed for History and Politics that wasn't available anywhere else. And they opened the British Library in like August 2020 for like 2 weeks in between lockdowns in the UK. I booked in for like the second day they were opened because they were letting like 50 people in at a time. I was like, I need to finish my Star Wars book. And I came out at the end of the day and I tweeted that any Twitter historians, British Library actually felt super safe because it was scary. It was a really, it was a weird, scary time of being in a closed building with people. There was loads of gaps. There was loads of people were masking, people were using hand gel, pre-vaccine. That felt all right, actually. And the British Library messaged me on Twitter to say, would you mind if we stuck that in a newsletter? We've just reopened and we want to let people know it's okay. I said, be my guest. I was like, okay, tell us a little bit about what you were doing. I said, okay, I was in there doing this research about Star Wars. They didn't put it in their newsletter. They tweeted it. Somebody at DK saw that and contacted me for Battles That Changed the Galaxy.
Battles That Changed the Galaxy is you and I think 4 other people.
It was 3 others. It was me, Jason Fry, Amy Radcliffe, Cole Horton, and the editor, David Fentiman at DK, who is just the best person, amazing.
Yeah, and that's a book that I found super valuable. So like that's one of my pet favorite resource books. And I know that you worked on it, but I had no idea kind of how it happened. That's very neat.
Firstly, all of that story is like, no part of that is plausible. The YouTube channel, the First World War, the tweet, and none of it.
Oh yeah, it's not a career path that you can follow.
No. But what it is an expression of, as a really good idea or a bad idea, of me basically deciding to turn the things that I love into work.
Right.
That I didn't want to just be constrained by the First World War. Not that I don't find the First World War still engaging and interesting. I do. I was doing some stuff about it today. But firstly, once the First World War centenary has ended, all of us are a little bit like the last dodos on the rock. There's not necessarily a great demand for First World War historians anymore.
For the record, it has been done,
It has been done. I'm not making any plans for 2114 at the moment for the second centenary of the First World War. But I decided I wanted to do things that made me happy. That's it. I wanted to do stuff that made me happy, and historical computer games make me happy, and looking at Star Wars makes me happy, and the fact that it's led to all of these other things is stupid and ridiculous and makes me incredibly happy. But the academic side of it is I wanted to look at stuff that I found interesting. Star Wars, I think, is interesting.
As a historian, as a fake historian, you have this perspective that I think differs a lot from other people writing for and about Star Wars. Like within the system, we have people like Kristen Baber, who does journalist work. We have YA authors. Most of their background, I mean, you have someone like Daniel Jose Older, who like was a paramedic for a bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of these people are authors and storytellers, and you are kind of in a weirder place. What are the benefits or drawbacks of this academic perspective on the series?
The drawbacks are quite closely tied to my own kind of sense of anxiety. Let's take Battles That Changed the Galaxy as an example. Is that they hired me because I'm a historian, I know historical craft, in theory. They never checked. And could give it a sense of history, of, having been historied. My concern was that, the sentence, "This reads like a historian wrote it," depending on the tone in which that sentence is delivered, dramatically changes whether it's a compliment or a criticism. And I didn't want people to come away from Battles going, wow, 75% of this is amazing and 25% reads like a historian wrote it. I don't need that. I don't need that harpoon straight through my chest. As much as I would like to do, fiction writer, I'm not a fiction writer. I don't have the background. I can't be Jason Fry, and I can't be Cole Horton, and I can't be Amy Radcliffe. They are all both better at their jobs than I was going to be, and better at being themselves than I was going to be. I can't do what they can do. So that's a drawback when you're talking about working in a fictional space. There was a lot of trust, basically taken on trust, that I was going to be capable of doing this thing that they wanted me to do. And I don't know what would have happened if, when I just sent in my pages and they'd have gone like, "Thanks so much, Chris, but if you could just see yourself out, that'd be great." So that was a drawback in regards to the doing stuff for Star Wars. The drawback of being a historian studying Star Wars is it's the man with a hammer. Every problem starts looking like a nail that you need to hit it with. You know, I'm a historian, I'm looking at this stuff, and I'm deciding that this is a comment on history, comment on actual events and the like. The drawback of being a historian is I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an English literature expert, and I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm not an art historian. That's only a drawback in regards to the framing of it. What that means is that just because the book The History and Politics of Star Wars exists doesn't mean that there can't be a book on the philosophy and politics of Star Wars, which I will eat that book up. That sounds amazing. I am not the man to write it. I'm not capable of, I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the understanding, I don't have the background to be able to do that. The other issue of being a historian is that I'm an English historian or a British historian. So I'm going to assume that you two, from what I know of you and what I know about the podcast, and like you two got a massive kick out of Andor, I'm going to guess.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
So I got a massive kick out of Andor. I also got a really weird disjuncture out of Andor because I recognised all of the British actors in it from things that they've been in other things. There's, I've forgotten, the little fascist guy.
Cyril Karn.
His mate in, like, industrial fascist police.
Sure.
Who's a Scottish guy, played, like, a domestic abuser in an English soap.
Supervisor Blevin, the guy who played him, was on Taskmaster, and I recognized him from that.
There we go. Now, that's just like a little weird funny thing, but there are things that I have no doubt in my analysis of Star Wars that didn't land on me because they're American. And it just doesn't exist in my concept of the world and events and the like. There's probably stuff in there, even about the Vietnam War or about, race relations in America or kind of American constructions of the family. Passed me by, didn't hear at all, didn't even see it as it whizzed past me because I don't exist in American culture. I have an understanding of it, but for whatever reason it didn't land. And that's both, again, an interesting drawback and an opportunity that, I reckon an American version of my book would probably read quite differently. But you're going to lose stuff of being the outsider looking in, being able to go, this is about America and it's weird.
Because really, for better or for worse, Star Wars is like extremely American, and I mean that both in an affectionate and insulting way.
Yeah.
But like, there are going to be different perspectives on it when you're not reading it as a person who is like, once again, for better or for worse, extremely steeped in what it means to be American and like all the weird cultural baggage that comes with.
So again, it's why podcasts like yours are going to be super interesting because you're seeing things that I can't see. They just don't exist in my construction of the world, which means that being a historian is a great benefit because an American historian will get something out of it. An American historian of race or empire will get something even more out of it.
Oh, yeah.
The possibilities are endless, and that's super exciting. That just because my book exists, I'm sure my publishers would like it to be the last word. The royalty checks that I would like to get at some point would help as well, but there's so much possibility for other historians to dig into it. And that's really cool. And philosophers or art historians or whatever to look at Star Wars. It's exciting. It should be exciting.
So we, I would say, are very lucky as a Star Wars community to continue benefiting from your point of view. Because on July 9th, at least in the US, I don't know if it's elsewhere in other territories.
It's 4th of July in the UK, which I think is hilarious.
Oh, hell yeah. If it were coming out over here for me, that's more of a celebration than I've had on that day in years. So handful of months away, we're going to see the release of The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Clearly a title inspired by the William L. Schreier book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. This is written as an in-universe entry. This is penned by historian Beaumont Kin from The Rise of Skywalker.
Space Hobbit. We're
going to be given an up-close look at the Imperial system, political organization, propaganda, economic strategy, and on top of all of it, warfare. Clearly a very rich avenue for discussion. The history and politics is very different from The Rise and Fall, right? The former is nonfiction and the latter is a lot more focused, much less broad. But Rise would still have to have quite the list of sources, right? When we're talking about the Galactic Empire, you have to draw from comics, from reference books, from television. How did your approach in writing history and politics vary from Rise and Fall?
With history and politics, again, as I mentioned earlier, loads of novels, loads of comics and computer games and the like. To an extent, that was both a blessing and a curse. When you sit down and go, okay, so what am I going to need to list? And then when you're onto the 3rd or 4th page of your notebook, it's like, God, this was a terrible idea. Barely even got through the 1990s yet. But at the same time, normally when I was doing research, when I was working on like First World War stuff, it's like, I need to go and read some letters from the trenches, or I need to go and look at some French newspapers or some diaries, and that means the Imperial War Museum or the French Military Archive, or, I need to raise some money to go over to these American archives. These are where the primary sources are. I need the primary sources. Whereas history politics, it was like, I need the primary sources. I will go upstairs. I will pull them off of the bookshelf because they've been there since the 1990s, and suddenly this is now working in my favour. But both a drawback and a benefit, I was the one who was going to have to process this stuff. I was going to have to kind of look over this stuff and understand this stuff and, reconnect with it, stuff that I hadn't necessarily read since the 1990s or the early 2000s. So now go back to it with a historian's perspective and see, does it say what I think it's vaguely remembering saying? Is it, what else am I going to get out of it? For Rise and Fall, again, you've got a ton of stuff to draw on. The benefit for it was, if I needed, it's like, I need some comics. I can't do this chapter without these comics. I'll just email DK and they'll ask Story Group and they'll ask Lucasfilm. They'll send me the PDF. It might take a few weeks, but it'll get here. And also, if I've got a question, I don't own it. None of it belongs to me, both in a very clear legal sense, but also in a more kind of philosophical, Star Wars belongs to everybody sense, that if I need examples or I have questions, even if I end up answering those questions myself, you have to interact and understand the mechanisms of DK and of Lucasfilm, which again is going to involve like going up through layers of communication and waiting for questions to come back down through it. Rise and Fall was collaborative in a way that History and Politics wasn't, because it was just me. It was just me sitting at home writing endless analysis about Star Wars and wondering if anybody was going to care. For Rise and Fall, a lot of trust was put in me for Rise and Fall. Maybe once the book comes out and people have read it, will understand the level of trust that was put in me with that book. And that trust, whilst given, and I'm incredibly grateful for, I also had to earn it and show that I understood what it was that we were doing with this thing to make it work for me, to make it work for the readers, to make it work for DK, to make it work for Lucasfilm. And as a result, Rise and Fall is scarier as an undertaking. And that fear hasn't entirely gone away, but when people see it in the way that I hope that people see it, I'm hoping that they're going to get a kick out of it.
I have to ask, I'm really fond of Skywalker, A Family at War by Kristen Baver. It is another very much in-universe sort of, it's kind of that pop historical text like we talked about earlier. But the thing that that I found really apparent while I was reading was I knew all of this stuff already. I had basically read everything touched on in that book. Is Rise and Fall more of a collection of information that has already been established? Or is it, I guess, more of like this creative writing project? How much are you adding?
To begin with, to go back to your point about Skywalker Family at War, Rise and Fall wouldn't exist without Skywalker Family at War. The precedent it provided us, so that when I went to DK and said, this is the idea that I want to do, because Kristen had done this as a precedent to kind of prepare the way for us, and I read Skywalker several times during the process. And also kind of like the debt of gratitude that I owe Kristen Baver herself, it will be very, very difficult to repay. We cast a very, very wide net for Rise and Fall of material. Comics, films, novels, computer games, TV shows, and the like. But I was given a staggering degree of freedom with material, carefully controlled, because Star Wars at Lucasfilm is so many moving parts. So sometimes you might suggest something and someone might say, this isn't necessarily something that happened, I'm just using it as an example. Say, I want to do X, and someone there goes, nah. Now, they might say nah because it's a rubbish idea, Chris. Go away and have a better one. Or, no, you can't do that because in 3 months' time, a comic's coming out that's going to partially reference this, and it's going to happen in 4 years' time in a film. And you'll never know which of those two things are until maybe 4 years' time when it comes out in a film. And you go, oh, that's why you said no. So you have that kind of controlled aspect. But I got a lot of access, both via questions that went up DK to Lucasfilm, to Story Group, and then with a visit to Lucasfilm in October last year to talk with them, to help populate and create things that people have never seen before about the Empire, or stuff that's been mentioned in passing and has never actually been explained what happened. Sometimes they'd say, well, okay, then show us what you want to do. Then I would get the opportunity to fill in those gaps, because I think they were getting at Lucasfilm a certain level of a kick out of it. They were on board with it, which massively helped. While Story Group and that exist to make sure things don't cross the streams and the like, they're facilitators. They're there to facilitate the vision of the creatives. I am not a creative on the level of literally anybody else who's ever touched Star Wars, but I was there to do a thing and they wanted to help me do that thing. The most important part, and I'm going to pick my words very, very carefully, because I want people to read and like the book, but I want people to get it. It's very hard for me to explain what that means outside of the most important part of the book is Beaumont Kin. There's a reason why I picked him. There are two things that are out in the world at the moment. One is the first line of the book, which I tweeted, and the other is the fact that it's written by Beaumont Kin. Both of those things existed in my head before the proposal was written. There's a reason why it had to be him. And, we said earlier on, historians make arguments. Beaumont Kin is making an argument. He has things that he wants to tell people, and he's going to draw on a lot to do it. And to do that, we had to fill in a lot of gaps that are things that are assumed about the Empire, but has never appeared, but now needed to exist. And I've been very fortunate that they let me do that. I don't know if anybody really understands what the book is yet, and I find that really interesting and quite fun. Again, absolutely crippled with anxiety about it. Do you know Dan Zare, who does Coffee with Kenobi?
I've seen him around.
I did a podcast with him. I was saying to him that nobody hired me on Battles to show people something they'd never seen before. The point of Battles was to make people go and look at something again, sit down and watch Battle of Yavin again, and go, oh, I'm getting something more out of it. That aspect is true about Rise and Fall, but I think it's also fair to say that it also exists to show people something they've never seen before about Star Wars and about that galaxy, that place, and about the Empire. I could swear both of you to secrecy and tell you the entirety of the book right now. I will get more enjoyment out of you reading and enjoying the book. My enjoyment is going to come out of hopefully you getting a kick out of it. The reason why I have to pick my words quite carefully is there's a possibility I get choked up about what this is, this opportunity that was given to me, the very existence of the book, but also what I'm hoping it's going to mean to other people. It's canon. The fact that Beaumont Kin has written this is canon. I can't explain what that means, but there's a lot of new stuff in this, or ways of understanding things that we already know that I find really exciting. Hoping other people find exciting as well.
I feel pretty confident that they will. I mean, what I know about it so far, I'm on board.
Given some of your very coincidental tweets during the writing process, that this one might land on you.
So, on the subject of this book being in universe, being canon, being an argument, when the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire was announced, there were a handful of people who were responding to the announcement with, kind of excitement that it would, as an in-universe historical text, be a thorough, neutral, unbiased account of the Empire. How even do you attempt an objective view of an imperialist regime without doing apologia? But also, do you think this book is that?
So I could kind of understand where people were coming from with that, because it could be quite interesting to write or read a book about the Empire written by the Empire, or written by the First Order or something like that. You know what? I think that would be super interesting to read, but I'm not saying this as like a harpoon criticism to throw at people. I think there is generally a misunderstanding of what historians do or what history books are. In that, I said earlier, historians make arguments and they make them in book form. People, I think, tend to think of historians as kind of encyclopedias or chroniclers. Here's a bunch of stuff that happened without any editorial voice or the like. And that's not how I write my history books. History and Politics has quite clear arguments through it. My book about Allied relations has clear arguments, and that's how historians work. So, firstly, the idea of a history book with an argument removed is not how I write history books. People can take from that what they want, except from, to reiterate what I said earlier, Beaumont Kin has an argument. There are things that he wants people to think about and to understand. I have no interest in writing a neutral book about the Third Reich or slavery or Stalin or any of these things. I don't even know what it would look like. And what's the benefit of writing a neutral book about, the transatlantic slave trade? A lot of people died, but it was really good for shipbuilding corporations. What is happy selling that and looking at yourself in the mirror, I guess? There's no interest. I don't want to be fair. Over here in England, there's a whole kind of field of imperial studies that uses the balance sheet approach to the empire. We did a lot of awful things in India, but we built railways. Okay. And when you say we, who do you mean? Because I'm pretty sure it wasn't us with the spades. The idea that you can balance out horror with some form of net good has always struck me as being kind of deeply peculiar, and I have no interest in taking part in it. So I don't think it's possible to approach those types of events neutrally, because you are risking apologencia. At some point, at some level, you're going to go, yes, X was bad, but it's counterbalanced by Y. And I don't think, firstly, that's how historical events and understandings work, but it's also not how, my morality works. It's possible that people might buy those books, but I don't want to write it. I have no interest in doing that. So I think it's a difficult one. There are historians who write books about the benefits of the British Empire. And, that's a whole life choice of itself. And those people are very welcome to make it, but I'm not signing up to their newsletters. I don't want to be in their club.
Just to finish off, I have to ask, what's the point? What is the academic or social value of studying Star Wars and other media depictions of warfare? Is there a point?
So the interesting thing about this question is I've been asked it in job interviews and they didn't like the answer. You mentioned earlier I did my PhD at the University of Sussex. There used to be a historian there, a professor, who sadly died a good number of years ago, but he did rural history, like working class, agricultural, rural communities history, which again, I know less than nothing about that, but I can see the benefit. It was cool. Lots of people got a kick out of it. But in a wider sense, he was fond of saying that if it matters to people, it should matter to historians. And that's the point. Computer games matter to people, they should matter to historians. Media matters to people, it should matter to historians. Star Wars matters to people, it should matter to historians. Because you can't understand any of these things without understanding the things that matter to them. It's like saying we shouldn't study Nazi approaches to opera. So, well, understanding the Nazi culture, it helps you inform you about Nazi society by understanding the things that they like or the things that they hate. If you want to understand why Star Wars is the biggest media thing on the planet and the impact that has on our world, then you actually have to look at it. It strikes me as wild when people dismiss Star Wars as being irrelevant. It's I can't think of anything more relevant. Just because it's pop culture or, low culture or it doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact. It's like saying, there's no benefit to be taken from literature. I kind of think there is. I think literature has actually had quite a large impact on human history and civilization from the dawn of time to yesterday. You can't just dispense with these things because you don't like them. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go and study it, but it's a worthwhile thing to study. As I try and say in the history and politics, quite a lot of what's going on in our world at the moment that doesn't appear to be connected to Star Wars is probably connected to Star Wars in regards to internet culture and concepts of good and evil and concepts of fascism and all of these things which are, quite concerning about the world that we're living in exist in this thing. And telling me that we therefore, there's nothing to be gained from looking at this thing, I just think you're insane. And it's an abrogation of my responsibility as a historian to discount this stuff. So that's why, because it matters. It clearly matters. People will not convince me otherwise. I refuse to be convinced otherwise that this doesn't matter and isn't important. If it matters to people, it should matter to historians. That's the reason why we should do this.
Maybe it comes from this place of elitism, frankly, but I think there's this impulse in not just academia, but a lot of different fields of study to assume that the things that are worth studying, your taste matters at all, right? And I think sometimes people view, more lowbrow culture or types of building meaning as less relevant. I'm a person, God, how does this keep coming up? I'm a person who is really staunchly non-religious. That is an important part of my identity. But I cannot pretend that religion is deeply and abidingly relevant to both the history of our world, the place that I'm from, and its political landscape right now. I don't have to like it. It's just true.
Yeah.
And certainly we are living in this often very silly, very complicated political situation where we have politicians or people running for office, certainly in America, who tweet about wokeness in Obi-Wan Kenobi, or whatever. Obviously, these things are relevant. I might want them to be less relevant. But they are, and clearly there is a lot of engagement with that idea, with this interplay between here is the real stuff, the stuff that matters, the stuff that we should care about, and here's the stuff that I do care about. That's kind of where this show is from, is it's me going, well, I do care about these things that I feel are really important, but I spend a lot of time reading Star Wars, and I'm not really going to stop doing the silly thing.
No.
So how does the silly thing affect the serious thing?
Large parts of Star Wars have been weaponized in the culture war. The culture war is going on around us. We need to understand what's going on. We need to understand, these reference points, even from a teaching point of view. Students were coming into my class during the First World War centenary, and the first time they'd interacted with the First World War was in a computer game. I could have stood at the front of the class and gone, well, computer games are pointless and stupid, but it doesn't make it so. You can't wish it out of existence. So you can either get on board or you can get out of the way. I don't need everybody in history and academia to like the things that I like. I kind of don't want them to because, I won't accept any competition. I'm clinging on by my fingernails as it is.
Yeah, you have your niche.
Yeah, I spent a while digging this thing out, but I don't want to get rooted out of it just yet. But the questions people ask about, what's the point of studying Star Wars or computer games? Like, what's the point of studying the Romans? How do they help us nowadays? People would look at me like, well, that's stupid. They're an important thing. It's like, yeah, leave me alone.
I think you're very, very right, Chris. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the good conversation. I think this show is much better off for having had it.
Thank you both, firstly, for having me come on. The fact that I'm here now is not a coincidence. Once the book got announced, I knew that people were going to get excited about it, and I was going to get lots and lots of things. And I knew that, you're a big fan of the history and politics of Star Wars, which would enable us to have the history and politics conversation, and then maybe a little bit of Rise and Fall. So this is the first time I have spoken about the Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, and it's not a coincidence that I chose to do it with you.
Well, thank you very much. I will warn you, this episode won't come out for like 3 weeks, but
that's fine. I'll be in Mexico by then, over the hills and far away if it turns out that I said the wrong thing.
Oh wow. You'll see that it's out eventually. Chris, where can our lovely listeners find you online and find your work? Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram. They're all at Chris Kempshall because I'm the only Chris Kempshall who's ever existed, which means I just get to claim all of the branding. Anything exciting happening, you'll find it out on there. I've got a website, which again, chriskempshall.com. You'll see little snippets and bits and pieces on there. I do my own podcast with some friends about pop culture and the First World War. It's called Oh What a Lovely Podcast, which I'm going to assume can be found in places where people get podcasts. Yeah, those are the places to find me. I'm pretty sure I have a code for getting money off the history and politics of Star Wars, which I will pop over so you can put in the show notes and the references and the like, and hopefully in 3 weeks' time that still works. And if it doesn't, buy like 6 full price copies, that's fine. Yeah, so those are all of the places that you can find me lurking, and then I imagine I'll become even more ubiquitous and annoying the closer to July we get. I very much hope so. Yeah, all of y'all, go follow Chris, go read, at the very least, History and Politics. I genuinely think it is a more disciplined approach to this topic than we do. We do the entertainment side, not a lot of edutainment. Yes, yeah. Thank you very, very much, Chris. Thank you both so much. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon, evening, weekend. I don't know what time it is anymore. Take care. All right, we're going to move over to some emails. Do you want to listen? You want to read some emails? I can read some emails. You don't have to read the emails. You don't have to read. Oh, good. I don't want to read. Reading is for cowards and losers. Except for Chris's book. Yeah, read that. Yeah, all of them. Okay. Our first email is from Bryce M. Bryce says, "Hi, Daughters of Ferrix. I have something that I really wanted your thoughts on, but first I want to say that I've been loving your podcast. I've only started listening recently, but I'm so glad that I did. Your episodes always make me laugh out loud, and I'm so happy to find a queer Star Wars podcast. Star Wars actually helps to figure out parts of my queer identity. I literally had no idea what asexuality was until Leox Gazi. And as a queer teenage Star Wars fan, I'm so grateful to see queer creators paving the way in a fandom that hasn't always been the most welcoming. I'm rambling a bit now, and if you happen to read this on your podcast, I don't want you to have to read aloud a whole essay, so I'll cut to my main topic now." Sorry, Bryce. In the beginning of The Last Jedi, my favorite Star Wars movie, by the way, which is usually a shock to most people. Ours too, Bryce, actually. Poe Dameron single-handedly charges the First Order Fulminatrix Dreadnought, taking out all of their surface cannons and giving the Resistance enough time to evacuate. However, once the evacuation is complete, Leia orders him to disengage and return to the Raddus. From the novelization by Jason Fry, we also learn that Admiral Akbar agrees with this. Poe strongly disagrees and disobeys Leia, leading the charge into one of the most heartbreaking scenes in Star Wars. The Resistance takes down the Dreadnought thanks to Paige Tico's sacrifice, but loses all of its bombers and a large portion of a starfighter squadron. As a result of his insubordination, Leia slaps and demotes Poe once the fleet is in hyperspace. Leia considered the cost of destroying the Dreadnought to be too high, with so many crucially needed pilots dead. But Poe remains convinced that he made the right call because Dreadnoughts are powerful pieces on the chessboard. I'm curious to know if you think Poe was justified in taking out the Dreadnought, or if he should have listened to Leia, and what would have been different if Poe didn't destroy the Dreadnought. Thank you so much for this podcast, Bryce M.
Insubordination will not be tolerated in my Rebel Alliance / Resistance.
But do you think it would have worked? Like, do you think they still would have
I don't know if it would have changed anything.
I feel complicatedly about this. On one hand, they took out the Dreadnought's surface cannons. That's a big deal. At that point, it's partially just this big ass piece of metal. They would still track the Resistance through hyperspace from Dakar to Oechi. But what I'm not sure about is the big ass cannon on the underneath. If the Dreadnought follows after them when they make the jump, can they just charge?
Turn sideways and then like pew pew and then blow up the Radis? I don't know.
I feel like the big ass giant destroyer cannon for planetary assault that's on the underside of the Fulminatrix would have kind of meant the end of the Radis. I mean, it takes some time to charge up, but it takes less time to charge up than it did for them to kind of chase after the Radis slowly in space, right? I think Poe was lucky to be a little bit right. The way that the plan was unfolding, I very much see Poe as being insubordinate, very clearly. If hyperspace tracking was not a technology that the First Order catastrophically had, they would have just gotten away. It would have been fine. They would have lost some guys and it would have sucked ass, but way less than the people that Poe got killed. And they only have so many starfighters. They lost people and ships, and it was a huge loss, and the Resistance was smarting from it for the next year.
Forever.
Well, not forever. They win. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good question because I have been assuming that Poe was only simply wrong. I think that his contribution ended up being somewhat right. Thank you so much for your email and your kind words, Bryce. Our next email is from Elijah Sawyer. Hi, Daughters of Ferrix. After recently discovering your episode on the Path of the Open Hand, your podcast has become my go-to listen while stocking shelves at work. I'm a queer Star Wars fan, and I absolutely love the perspective that the two of you bring to Star Wars. I deeply enjoy how each episode explores a specific, somewhat niche topic in intense detail, citing specific sources and information I would not have sought out otherwise. Since you've previously mentioned that you have experience with TTRPG games, my question for the two of you is this. If you were to run an RPG game set in the Star Wars universe, what time period is the most compelling to you in regards to that kind of storytelling? Again, huge fan of the podcast, and I've referred it to all my friends. Thanks, Eli. Cheers, Eli Sawyer.
I don't know anything about TTRPG. That's all Ellie's thing. However, the period that is most interesting to me at the moment in Star Wars is like the whole like Weimar Republic thing that they have going on in the fall of the New Republic. I think that's very interesting.
That's actually probably also my choice. I don't know. I think you could do fun stuff with the Cold War. I think as a GM, I'm very much someone who GMs. I don't really PC. I see a lot of tension to be had in the rising threat of the First Order and also the New Republic being kind of an obstacle, kind of a stick in the mud. The Cold War is ongoing. So if your PCs are taking direct action against the First Order, that could legally be a problem, which I find really fun. You have to go to New Republic jail because you killed some fascists that were bullying a town or whatever, and you feel that you're right, so you have to break out. That sounds very fun to me. So I think we're on the same page with that. Thank you very much for your email, Eli. Our next email is from Joel Davis. Joel says, hello, Daughters of Ferrix. Long time no see, lol. Joel sent this right after we had been on Joel's show, Ion Cannon. Today, I wanted to ask you something that's been on my mind for a while. Would you like to see more planetary politics and how the planetary affects the galactic in terms of the major factions like the Republic or even the Empire? To put it in American terms, how do state politics affect federal politics? For example, if the planets that make up the Republic Senate are, for lack of a better term, liberal democracies, then I think the Senate will hold those more democratic values because the planets the senators come from hold those values. However, when you start having planets that have absolute monarchs or hold imperial sentiments, you'll also start to see that more at the galactic political level. A good example of this is the book Bloodline, where the centrist faction is made up of many former imperial worlds, including Coruscant. Anyway, curious to hear your thoughts on wanting to see more planetary politics and how the values of individual planets will affect the galactic institutions they're a part of. Love the podcast as always, Joel Davis.
Well, what I will say is that Mandalore is definitely a red state.
Yeah,
they're voting for Donald. That being said, I do think it would be rather interesting to kind of explore how, Nabooian queen elections or whatever are, influencing galactic politics.
Yeah, I don't know. I think on a larger scale, whenever anyone asks us, do we want Star Wars to be more politically complicated, the answer will generally be yes. Because
always.
I have this extremely unrealistic anxiety, which is that eventually we'll run out of things to talk about on the show. So, definitely more for that reason. No, but like, we talk about the Republic as its own state, but it kind of isn't. It's made up of constituent territories.
It's the UN if the UN had regulatory power.
And that's kind of weird. Not weird in that it exists, but weird in that we almost never talk about it like that. In reality, the interplanetary conflicts that would be going on, not necessarily war, but just trade disagreements and that kind of bullshit, would completely change the landscape of the galaxy, right?
Yeah, they really should have like the article of the Galactic Constitution that says you can't regulate trade between planets unless you're the galactic government. That was a real oversight on their part.
They might technically have that.
But everyone's ignoring it.
Yeah, we know they don't enforce laws. I don't know. I do think that would be a really welcome addition to the way that we view the Republic at any point. I mean, the Republic really feels like a monolith. Part of that is because it is this golden age, and part of that is because the story's about Jedi and stuff like that, and so it's not really about what different planets, different sectors are doing. I would appreciate a little more of that. I think it would go a long, long way. Thank you so much for your email, Joel. Our last email is from Dammy. Dammy says, "Evening, comrades. Discovered your podcast last week, and I genuinely have zero notes. Consistently floored by how articulate and intelligent..." Sorry, Dammy. Sorry.
That's funny. One of us is articulate and intelligent. It's not me.
I don't think you get to make that call. The depth of your research and then your masses of passion for Star Wars. One of us is passionate about Star Wars, and it's not me.
Shut the fuck up. The other one is passionate about politics. That's me.
Uh-huh.
I'm the politics guy.
You're really giving flashbacks to the first episode. It's really validating seeing two people love something the same way I do, engaging with it deeply and analytically from so many different angles and actually doing something with that analysis. I'm inspired to get off my ass and make something out of my fixations. I'm not a big podcast guy, but I'm genuinely sad I'm almost caught up. The Nazi gold story? Gold. The way Ellie retold the stories of the High Republic and tells stories in general? Gold. The two of you having a spirited and well-informed discussion about battleship models and naval history? Gold. All your guests have been great too. I found Alden's discussion of religion envy as a secular leftist race religiousist so relatable. And that's a very specific feeling I'd never seen someone share before. Every episode is genuinely high-level academic grade research. Sorry, Dammy. I'm sorry. You are being so genuinely kind. This email is such an outpouring of love. And it's very hard to read aloud kind of for that reason. There are ways in which I'm definitely a very self-centered person, but I'm very grateful that you are saying such kind things. Every episode is genuinely high-level academic grade research and speaking, but funny and about Star Wars. Also, Sophie's rant in the latest episode about leftist infighting made my day. Extremely based and once again inspiring to me to get off my ass and do some organizing. I could gush about the podcast all day, but I know you get a lot of these, so I don't want to make it too long. May the force be with you, Dammy.
And also with you.
Thank you very, very much, Dammy. I think it can be hard. We were just talking about it with Chris. I think it can be hard as someone who's into some very silly things and some very serious things to kind of interact with the way those intermingle. And let's be clear, this podcast is silly. This podcast talks about some serious stuff, but it exists for entertainment. I don't think that what we're doing is academic work. I'm not an academic. I dropped out of university after 3 weeks.
I wish I dropped out of university after 3 weeks.
This show is, not to be taken too seriously, but I don't know. Sometimes I think it's worth having conversations with some weight. And I'm very, very glad that that has resonated with you. So thank you for your kind words. Mm-hmm. If you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, you can send them to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
If you want to listen to new episodes as they release every other Wednesday, you can find us on most places you can listen to podcasts, on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, spelled FERRIXPOD.
If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/daughtersofferrix. I have been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. Sophie?
I have been Sophia Dunstan. You can find me at Sophia in SLC on Twitter and at my other podcast at the Redline_pod, where we talk about trains on Twitter.
This episode was written and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening. Talk about Star Wars in a complex way, and I don't know, read the news for once in your goddamn life. Come on.
The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's really good, even though it's 1,200 pages.
Yeah, read the book and tell us what you think about it. Okay, bye-bye.